Hi, my name is Sojung Bahng. I'm an artist and researcher in Sensilat Monash University in Melbourne, Australia.
And my name is Ryan Kelly. I'm a research fellow in the School of Computing and Information Systems at the University of Melbourne, also in Australia.
Today, we'll talk about our KAI paper called Reflexive VR Storytelling Design Beyond Immersion, Facilitating Self-Reflection on Death and Loneliness.
Our paper focuses on Anonymous, an interactive cinematic virtual reality piece. We describe the design process behind Anonymous and present findings from a study of the audience experience. Our overall aim in this research was to explore how the use of distancing effects in VR can elicit audience awareness and self-reflection about loneliness, death, and the concept of the no-relationship society.
Let me briefly explain the background of this research. Many filmmakers and artists have tried to use VR technologies to create empathic experience because people can easily embody other perspectives and feel like they are actually experiencing another person's life. However, the storytelling design for immersive engagement without critical distance has potential pitfalls, including objectifying others' pain without critical awareness and identifying with other people without acknowledging fundamental differences between the self and others. As Levinas notes, the other is inherently transcendental. We can't easily encounter or understand the concrete other. We should accept the limitations of our understanding of the other and not try to erase the difference between us. Based on these perspectives, reflexive dimensions have been explored in several art forms, including back-to-bright distancing effects in theater and in avant-garde filmmaking. Reflexive theater and cinema both sustain immersion and identification to encourage critical awareness and reflection. However, the reflexive modes of distancing effects have not yet been sufficiently explored in VR. Applying distancing effects to VR is challenging because it can disrupt VR's fundamentally immersive nature. Nevertheless, we can develop reflexive storytelling using the limitation of immersive engagement that comes from the technical restrictions and media constraints inherent to VR, which do not necessarily break immersion. Our practical investigation draws from prior research in several disciplines, including HCI, film and media studies, and media art, specifically related to storytelling in cinematic VR and the use of distancing effects in digital media. In this presentation, we'll focus mainly on explaining our creative project Anonymous. Please refer to our paper for the prior research related to this project. Anonymous concerns the so-called no-relationship society in South Korea, a concept that originated in Japan where it is known as Muyansaki. The no-relationship society refers to the phenomenon of older people living and dying alone. In South Korea, people increasingly live alone and die alone, and are often only found weeks or even months after their death. We wanted to use cinematic VR to elicit audience awareness about the no-relationship society and allow them to reflect on loneliness and death in their own life. To create Anonymous, we conducted an iterative design process to build an immersive virtual environment. We used the cardboard textures to symbolize fragility, familiarity, and recyclability. We first created the small-scale physical model using cardboard to understand the aesthetics, structure, and narrative. Then we translated the cardboard texture to the 3D virtual environment in VR. We designed the narrative so audiences assume the role of a deceased person who watches a solitary family member by inhabiting objects in the virtual environment. The audience inhabits different objects in the scene by gazing at them for a while. We aim to deformalize the familiar objects through their poetic reconstruction. The objects represent and embrace South Korea's history and everyday life in social context. The main character is called the widower. He was created using cardboard. His facial expressions are conveyed via childish drawings, and his eyes and mouth often disappear, leaving a blank face. To animate this character, we use motion capture techniques. The widower moves like a human being, but his body's cardboard constructions cannot perfectly handle that movement, creating imbalances or tensions between familiarity and unfamiliarity. The basic narrative structure involves the main character preparing an annual ceremony to memorialize his dead wife. As a deceased wife, the audience visits the main character's house for the annual ceremony. The audience becomes a different objects by gazing at them, including a television, a telephone, a butterfly, and a live bird. Hi, Dad. Sorry. Through the interactions with these objects, the audience observes his life from various perspectives. Here we see the perspective from the butterfly. And in this image, we look down on the widower from the perspective of a live bird. After the ceremony is over, the deceased wife leaves the home and becomes a star. The audience is taken outside the widower's house. And they find themselves pirouetting upwards toward the stars.
After finalizing Anonymous, we conducted a study to explore the audience experience and understand which design factors and elements prompted reflexive thoughts and feelings. The study was conducted in a quiet and private environment where participants were able to view Anonymous using an Oculus Go headset. We allowed participants to watch the experience, which lasted approximately 15 minutes, and then conducted in-depth interviews. We had 23 participants, 10 of whom identified as female and 13 as male. Our participants' ages ranged from 25 to 70, with an average of 38 years. This allowed us to explore possible generational differences. 10 participants were from South Korea, and 13 were from other countries. This allowed us to explore possible cultural differences in the audience's interpretation. In the interviews, we asked searching questions such as, what are your first thoughts and feelings about this work? Did this remind you of anything? And what did you think about the main character? We used a semi-structured interview process, asking further questions to follow up on comments made by participants. Using thematic analysis, we identified 4 reflexive dimensions that characterize the audience's experience. We did not observe distinct differences between genders, nationalities, or age. The first reflexive dimension is the use of abstract and minimal aesthetics. We found that the design of the virtual environment in Anonymous elicited projection with emotional distance. Because it was not too realistic, participants were able to maintain an emotional distance to project their own feelings and thoughts, which is reflexive. For example, one participant told us that since it is all made of cardboard, I didn't need to focus on many trivial details. I could only see the essence of his expression and action. Another said that he reminds me of my dad that passed away. He reminds me of being old. And there is my husband. Because I already became part of that woman, I felt he is my husband. The second dimension is the use of everyday materials and textures within the piece. The use of cardboard material applied in an unusual way made familiar things seem strange, stimulating reflexive sensation and thought. For example, one participant said, it creates the sense of artificiality, but because it is such an everyday material, so it made it more physical. Another said, the material is soft and warm. I felt the loneliness in general, but I also felt that the director or author had a basic affection for the main character, so it's warm loneliness.
We found that restricting the audience control within the virtual world, such as by limiting interactions and navigation, provoked a sense of fragility, vulnerability, and acceptance, which are feelings associated with loneliness and death. One participant explained that they felt claustrophobic at the beginning. You feel trapped, but you feel released, but free now. It is like a happy set. We all have to deal with death, and it will affect them somehow. You have no control, but forced to think about those things. Another said that I felt helpless and loneliness because nothing I can do. When the moment I was trapped in the very solemn moment. When I go up to sky, I feel like I'm actually going away. It is kind of sad. I think about the question of death. We discovered that using various disembodied perspectives and different points of view provoke awareness about the participants' own self-perceptions. One participant said that my perceptions are constantly expanding, but my identity is not exactly defined. I think the piece made me think about myself and beyond life, observing life. Another participant reflected, there is no mirroring space, it goes back to the very fundamental awareness of a person's consciousness. Staying away from human-centric narrative, it forced you to be reflective, to question, what are you in this time and space, and what am I?
In conclusion, we found that Anonymous elicited deep reflection on participants' own experiences of death and loneliness. Previous work in HCI has explored the use of other mediums, such as physical objects or photographs, for provoking this type of reflection. Our work extends this literature by contributing evidence of how VR can be designed to encourage reflexive thinking through the application of distancing effects and the creation of reflexive dimensions within a VR story.
All four factors were exploited based on the concept of exploring the technical limitations of VR technologies, such as the limits of realistic representations, restrictions of immersion and interactivity, and partial disembodiment. Overall, this research suggests that cinematic VR has the potential to be an effective tool for representing life experiences by providing new kinds of embodied reflections that force the audience's thoughts and feelings to surface while maintaining an ongoing bodily awareness. Since we finished Anonymous, the piece has been shown at a number of international film festivals, including the Busan International Film Festival in South Korea, Tbilisi International Animation Festival in Georgia, and Torino Short Film Market in Italia. If you'd like to experience the full version of Anonymous, please contact us. We are happy to share.
Thank you for watching our video.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.